Hi and welcome to Background Fundamentals. A little while ago we managed to have a lecture here in Sydney with Lars Borg. Lars is a principal scientist at Adobe and he's involved with the Asus Color Committee. He's just a really central figure in Adobe's color science. And we had this lecture in Sydney that people could attend. And after that, I interviewed Lars. Now, what I've decided to do is I'm going to play that interview for you, but I really think you need to kind of hear my version of Lars' talk before the interview. It's pretty geeky, but it's also really exciting. And I think I can present you the kind of groundwork that'll make then sense of Lars's words. I think if we jump straight into Lars's stuff, you might get a little lost because it's, for some of you, I'm sure, quite new concepts. So suffice it to say, this is based on Lars's talk. This is where Lars lives in Hawaii, and we really appreciated Adobe's help in doing this. So let's start with the idea of color management. It's been going for obviously a long time. It's had various movements, different things that have been happening in the film and in the print industry, in particular in stills. And I want to focus just on one part of it right now, which is up this end, which was high dynamic range. Now, of course, here at FX PhD, we've done a lot on high dynamic range, and we use them every day for doing CG work, where we're going to take a bunch of bracketed shots and produce an image that has a higher dynamic range than I can see on my screen. That's a pretty simple concept, but I just want to think about that for a second. What we're talking about when we say high dynamic range is just that, like it's this idea that I've got a lot more latitude than the monitor can actually display. And we tend to think of that normally in terms of f-stops, right? It's like a lot of f-stop. It could be like much brighter or darker. We don't tend to think of it so much in terms of color, but if we just take that now from the stills world, where it was in Photoshop first, and now move it over into the effects world, we actually have an HDR that happens in, dare I say, video. And so that's what we're going to talk about, this new phenomenon of high dynamic range stuff that's happening in moving footage that relates to, but it's a bit different from what's happened in the past with high dynamic range and stills. So from now on in this lecture, when I'm talking about high dynamic range, I'm going to be referring to the non-stills version. Okay, so let's just get some terms clear right out of the gate. For this talk, and I'm going to use Lars's own definition, or rather terms, so that we can, if he refers to them later, you'll make sense. So there's ultra high dynamic range, or ultra high def, right? And that's ultra high def is like 4K, 8K, higher. It's the stuff above HD, but we're now talking in ultra high def in going bigger. Yeah, it's not about bit depth. This is just effectively resolution. Obviously, HD is something we all know and love. It's 1920 by 1080. It's a standard. We don't have this just one single standard for ultra high def. It's not like that the 4K is exactly, defined the way that a 1920 by 1080 is, which is kind of representing that the world is getting more flexible as we move forward with tech. And then there's the old SD or SDR. This is the old standard definition that is NTSC or PAL. Okay, and that's the stuff that we're kind of used to. And there are some carryovers from that world in terms of color science, not so much in resolution anymore, but in color science. And then we have this high dynamic range, which again is not a resolution thing. And an example of that would be Dolby Vision. Dolby Vision isn't the only HDR video, but it's one that I'll refer to because you've probably heard about it. So the Tomorrowland feature was the first film that was graded with Dolby Vision, and we've been talking to Wes Ball, a former FX PhD professor who's just shot and graded his latest Maze Runner film, and he did a grade in Dolby Vision. Now, this is really important. He did a grade in Dolby Vision. He didn't do the grade of the whole film in Dolby Vision. He did a specific Dolby Vision grade. And then we have the concepts of Asus and Asus CG. Now, we've done lectures here before about Asus, and I've mainly focused on the fact that Asus gives us a wider color gamut. In other words, it has more colors that it can refer to. In fact, normal Asus is so big that it can pretty much handle any color and colors that don't exist. If you like, in that colorimetry horseshoe, it gets bigger and bigger to the point that it's sort of gone off in the corners and there are colors there that are illegal. And that makes it a little hard because it's not very intuitive. And so very recently, they've introduced a sort of subset of it, which is a Asus CG. Now, the best way to think of this is we talk about floating point numbers and we talk about OpenEXR, and we tend to say that OpenEXR is floating point. And that's all sort of true. But if you're very precise about it, you'd actually say, well, it isn't a full 32-bit floating definition. OpenEXR is actually half float. It's 16-bit float. but for all intensive purposes, we just call it float. Similarly with Asus, the Asus CG is not all of the conceivable colors that Asus is, but it's as good as damn it, and we can just refer to Asus as being very, very, very wide gamut. It isn't technically Asus CG as wide as Asus, but for the rest of this conversation, I'll just interchange those concepts, that it's just like I'll say OpenEXR is floating point. I won't stop and be very particular about the fact that OpenEXR is in fact only half float, because we just don't care, right? It's so good, it's so much in that direction that we want, that the difference between the two is sort of important sometimes, but for this conversation, not very important at all. As I said, gamut is really important. That is the range of colors. And when you look at a chromatic diagram, that horseshoe, you don't get to see black and white so much as you get to see, R, G, and B, the colors and the color space that we're in. And so that's something that is very wide if it encompasses a lot of colors. Now, good old-fashioned Rec. 709, the color space definition of more standard television, is a subset. It's a really small, effectively, set of colors that you can produce. There are a bunch of colors that we can perceive it can't produce. And so when you go from Rec. 709 out to Asus, it's a huge jump. And so there's obviously other color spaces that exist between those two. And then, of course, there's the old issue of gamma and linear, the idea of log versus normal looking. And we know that if I take an image and I have it as linear, it doesn't kind of look normal to me. And I put a gamma curve on it. And quite often I'll put a gamma curve on it, or I'll put a LUT on it, and I'll actually have a bunch of things that are temporarily put on top of this linear file so that it looks okay to our eye and has the non-linearity aspects that are relevant to what we're trying to do. Okay, so that's where we start from. Let's quickly now go into what's going on. Imagine I had this great new monitor, and it looked awesome. It looked so good because it had much richer colors. The blacks were really black. They weren't kind of sort of washed out, and it just looked more vibrant. Well, that's exactly what I saw a year or two ago when I first saw Dolby Vision. I saw this monitor, and I thought I won't be able to tell the difference because it's here and with normal ambient light, and I was knocked on my ass that it looked so much better. So there's this real thing already out there that is a Dolby Vision monitor that just looks really good. There's also different forms of kind of laser projection Dolby Vision that you can have in a projected environment. And they just look sensationally good. They're just not very common right now. So as I said, only a few films, like 4, I think, have been graded for Dolby Vision, so it's like really tiny. And you don't go up to the local Best Buy and buy a Dolby Vision monitor, but it's obviously coming, and it's a huge difference. And I would say it's the thing that I've actually been championing for some time, which is we didn't actually need to go up to 8K and 16K monitors, because once we get up to 4K or anything close to it, it looks really good. What we want is a better looking image, and the better looking image actually comes, I think, much more now from focusing on those colors and the dynamic range than it does from resolution. We've had a resolution race, and I feel like it's kind of petering out, and what we need to now start worrying about are these other things. So let's say I bought an HDR camera, which I can't do right now, but imagine tomorrow the Blue company comes out with the Blue camera, and the Blue camera is this HDR fully spec'd up camera that's got Dolby Vision logos on it or whatever it has, and I buy this magic new camera. And obviously this is all coming, but I'm just going to use this as a hypothetical right now and say, I have therefore a camera capture system, I have a projection system, I've got my monitor or I've got my laser projection, whatever. What I'm going to want to do is the bit in the middle, right? I want to do the post workflow. And of course, you'd expect FX PhD to be able to teach you how to do that. So that's where we come in here. If I did that, if I set up this new workflow and tomorrow I had this new camera that we had photos of on Facebook and Twitter and stuff, and we were all enthusiastic, and the monitor, and we were posting that on, whatever, what you'd expect is that for a fair while, I mean years, you'd be mixing HD, Ultra HD, and this new color thing, right, which we're calling HDR. In fact, you're probably mixing SD, HD, Ultra HD, and stuff to do with this very, very vivid looking stuff we're calling HDR. But I don't want you to think of it being SD, HD, Ultra HD, because those are steps up in resolution. The idea of the HDR isn't so tied into the idea of screen resolution. Sure, if I had this new Blue camera or whatever it is, it probably would be very high res, but that's not the point. The point is it wouldn't have to be to qualify as being HDR. So what would the issues be? The color challenges would be threefold. If we had our normal HDR pipeline and that came in and we made HDR TV production type stuff to put on monitors and output it as an HDR, that would be great. I'd love that. If I brought in stuff that was from SD and HD, I'd have some issues. I'd have to convert them from SD to HDR. If I did that, or even if I took in stuff from the HDR camera, I'd have to do some HDR color grading. And that would be different, actually very different from what we do right now. And then, of course, when I'm finished, I'd have my HDR output, but I'd also want to output something that was standard def or HD for everybody that hadn't bothered to get their new monitors yet. So those are the three issues. We're going to convert stuff up to HDR, we're going to deal with stuff in HDR, and we're going to have to, when we finish, not only display that, but also do a output that works on a normal monitor. Seems fair enough, but those are the issues. Some of those haven't really been a problem in the past, but getting the same colors to match in this larger color space is an issue. It's not insignificant, it's not trivial. And also, we want to enhance the viewing to take advantage of our HDR monitor. So when we're doing the grading, that second step, we're going to want to have cool tools that let us do cool grades, right? I mean, otherwise, why are we bothering to go to all this trouble if we can't produce really, really good results? Well, let's have a look at that in terms of what it means for the color. And in HD and Rec 709 and that kind of stuff, you've got these narrow color volumes. And then when you go to ultra high def, they tend to be either narrow or narrow and wide. And so you can have a ultra high definition that happens to be a wide color gamut. And then you have HDR, which tends to be a wide color gamut. In other words, it's a bigger thing than Rec 709, just as the ultra high def can be, but it's also very tall. And that's a big difference. There's plenty of headroom above 100 IRE for white, and similarly below 0. So you've got more colors when you go wide, but when you go high dynamic range, just with the stills, we have a lot more latitude. So we just got this taller and wider phenomenon. So, okay, seems fair enough. Let's assume that I've got my standard HD pipeline and I'm running stuff through. Well, how do I match the colors? That's the problem. How do I match it so that the stuff that looks good on the HD monitor also looks good on the HDR monitor and vice versa? And to get that working is a little harder than what you might think. Let me give this illustration. In SD and HD, so we're going back a few years now, HD first comes out, we're all sitting around and we want to look at HD and SD. If we look at these patches on the right, they look the same, right? The conversion between the RGB in SD and the RGB in HD was pretty much a non-issue. It just sort of lined up, right? And so therefore we didn't kind of worry about it. We just sort of thought of it as being, you've gone from SD to HD, it's just a resolution shift. It's basically like a higher res version. Like whatever it was, 525 comes up to 1920 by 1080. Okay. If we do that philosophy with HDR, it's wrong. It's really wrong. As you can see on the right, if we just take those colors and then start working them in HDR world and don't pay any attention to it, it's a radically incorrect solution, as you can see from the patch on the right. It's just not acceptable at all. Okay, so that's okay, right? We've got ways around this. We've learnt this problem from Asus workflow and stuff, and we've had that term where we talk about it being scene referred or linear scene referred or scene referred linear. You know, those are the words that have been bounced around, and we've kind of accepted that, and we haven't really thought much about it. But let me just reiterate what happens. When I do an Asus workflow, the whole idea is that I kind of refer back to the cameras and convert from whatever the cameras are doing into my Asus color space, and I sit there in this perfectly marvelous space, but all the cameras, when they come in to my Asus workflow, kind of get normalized into this one mega space that everything's really cool at. And I may rely on the camera manufacturers to help me get into my Asus color workspace, but the theory is once they're all in, we're all on the same playing field. I don't have different characteristics anymore for the Red camera or the ARRI. Now, that little discussion seems really simplistic, but I've never mentioned in that discussion the output. See, it's scene referred. I'm referring to the scene. I'm dealing with cameras. I'm looking towards the start of the process to be able to solve that problem. And if we do that for the HDR, we don't work. We actually get an image here, and you can see that there is actually a noticeable difference in the HDR. It's like a slight mismatch now. It's not as bad as it was before, but it's actually not an accurate match. And the reason for that is that the cameras actually do work They actually do pre-processing before they actually get to the point of handing them on. They have a gamma encoding process, but before the gamma encoding, you actually have a matrixing of the colors that happens at the camera end. That means that they just don't quite match. And so a wide gamut just won't work and won't naturally go in if we go to the scene referred version. Okay, what if we just take the HDR video and display it and look at it without doing anything, like HDR to HDR? You get this sort of washed out look. So the bottom HDR display look is going to look kind of orangey. The top HD display is looking more vivid. So if we take it all the way through the pipe, if we just do some transfer functions, our video is going to look washed out if we take the HD to HDR. Okay, so that's not going to work. So what can we do? Well, we can go the other way. Instead of being scene referred, we can actually be going the other way and be referencing the display. And if we do that, it is actually possible to take the HD and convert it through so that we get accurate colors in almost every case. And then we get the HD and the SD and the Ultra HD and the HDR having a match. And so that's actually possible. And the guys like Lars have done that. And so there are accurate conversion tables that are not scene referred now, but display referred, that get us back. And I've got a reference there to one of his papers if you want to go into that. I'm not going to go into the maths of doing that conversion. I'm just saying it is absolutely possible to do it. We're just doing it a different way than we did with Asus. Okay, so now we got back to the problem of, let's say we are in HDR in the middle, our second case, and we just want to do stuff. And you'll hear in my interview some examples of how a simple operation like a gamma change just doesn't work to get contrast in HDR. In other words, the tools that we have right now, the video grading tools, just don't work properly. You turn a knob and you think you know what you're going to get, and you get something radically different by a substantial amount. I won't go into that a lot more right now because I'm going to talk to Lars about it in one moment. But we actually have to get the industry to produce us some new tools so we can grade properly in HDR. So it isn't just a matter of using exactly the same sort of algorithms that we've used up until now and making it work. Now we get to the third one. The third one is downrezzing, if you like, or going from the HDR back down to the standard def. And there are ways of doing that to make that work. But we have to be really careful here because the idea of a high dynamic range to a non-high dynamic range image is something that we've already hit before. And here are some examples. The first of them is everything getting crushed because you've got this high dynamic range, so you just kind of balance for it. And that means that the darks become very, very dark and everything gets crushed. The other idea, and you'll remember this from Photoshop, is we do tone mapping. Now, I think tone mapping is a ghastly look, but a classic thing that happens with tone mapping is you get a haloing effect. So if you look at the top of that house, the house has been lifted up, the sky has been kept at a sensible kind of level, you have effectively a mismatch, but you've now sort of brought them back into the same two spaces. And there's effectively a blur line between them, and that blur line is the sort of the halo. In other words, the house comes up with kind of a soft bubble around it, the sky comes the other way, and you merge them together and you get halation or a glow around objects. And then the last one is color shift. So this is a shot of a neon sign, and I can assure you that the neon in the middle wasn't bright yellow, but casting out very strong red light around it. And we'd know that, right? Because we don't expect that that was what a neon sign would look like. But that's what's happening when we just do the color shift. We get the color shift when converting down, we're not doing it correctly. We get these bizarre things that happen due to clipping and due to the spaces. Now, it is possible to fix these things, it is possible to reduce it and do it properly, but you do have to do it properly to not get the artifacts and not have the enormous hit. And the other thing about this, as Lars will say, is that we don't have an automated process. Because when we start getting into this area, we need an artistic interpretation of what you want the image to look like. So this is no longer an algorithmic problem, but you just plug some numbers in. There's one more thing to talk about before we get to that interview, which is the idea of not necessarily locking in your HDR grade, but having it as metadata. And so just to be clear about this particular one, there's a great concept that the guys have come up with, and I think this diagram hopefully explains it. You get an HDR master, you do an alternate grade for SD, and you have metadata that goes along with the file. And that means that, in fact, it's a bit like a LUT that I started the discussion with. It's kind of stuff that travels with it, and it's a difference, if you like, between the SD grade and what you want for the HDR grade. And that information goes to the special device. So let's say we're using Dolby Vision to be simple about this. I would have a system that did that, and then I would feed the file, and my Dolby Vision monitor would look up the file and say, oh, I am a high dynamic range device, so I'll take that extra information that Mike encoded and use it to display Mike's pictures properly. But another monitor will come along and not recognize the metadata and just sit with the standard grade version of the same material. The dumber TV doesn't understand the metadata, so it ignores it, and you get the SD grade. The clever TV sees the grade information, adjusts all its internal sort of variables, and voila, I have a great HDR monitor. And my theory, personal theory now, not necessarily Lars, but you'll hear this in the interview, is that what will happen is that'll probably end up at some kind of distribution hub. In other words, instead of the monitor being the one, you'll have a device at a dub shop, at a dubbing place, that'll say, hey, I want to output 2 masters right now, and you'll press a button and it'll either use the metadata or not, but the one file will then be able to spit out the 2 things, and the one file will have both of those grades encapsulated, and just the outputs from our new box will give us one or the other. But as I say, the monitor guys think that they'll build that into their tellies. In my opinion, what they try to do with tellies is make them as cheap as possible. So the less circuitry, the better, but who knows? I could be proven wrong. Okay, well, that's my kind of overall, if you like, version of Lars' talk that tries to address these 3 issues: the SD to HDR, it could be HD to HDR conversion. Once we're in HDR world, the fact that the grading won't be the same for really good reasons that you'll hear Lars talk about in one moment. And finally, that when we're coming out, we want both an HDR version and some kind of SD version or HD version, and that has to be dealt with properly because it won't happen automatically. And similarly, we want to make sure that the HDR version looks as good as possible. Okay, having said all that and given you the primer, and hopefully that makes a bit of sense, now let's hear from the man himself. Lars, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. So I was wondering if you could just sort of outline for us. We are at this point now where people have got comfortable with the idea of 4K, especially for acquisition. But as much as people tend to focus on 4K or even now 8K and stuff, to me the much more interesting game is not whether you get more pixels across or vertically, but what happens in terms of the depth, in terms of saturation of colors, in terms of just vibrancy of the imagery. And we're at a real nexus now with the development of the HDR, I guess, type system.
Well, HDR itself, with the proper encoding, doesn't require more bits than high-quality SDR. With the ST2084, the PQ curve, you can sort of, you spread out your code values into the high dynamic range, into the overbright levels, in a way that doesn't use more bits than a high-quality SDR encoding. But today, your SDR encoding is often just 8 bits, so that's no good. You need more bits.
Yeah.
But yeah, go to 10 or 12 bits and you get good HDR. If you have 10 or 12 bits for SDR and you go to the wide color gamut, that's also a good rendering. I don't think you would ever want to have 8 bits going forward.
No.
Get rid of that. But also if you go to the wide color gamut, like the 2020 color gamut, as I said in my talk here, you need one more bit just to accommodate the wider color gamut with the same, well, banding issues, whatever you have within the regular gamut. So, but no one is doing 9-bit systems, so you go to 10-bit, you get better quality, and hopefully we'll get you to move to 12 bits.
So if I was shooting stuff and somehow capturing everything, processing everything, and outputting to a HDR set of monitors and equipment, that's a pretty simple equation, right? It's like it's apples to apples to apples, but that isn't really where it's going to lie for the colorist, for the video professional, for the cinematographer. It's going to lie in when you start mixing stuff up, isn't it?
Yes, you're importing SDR contents into HDR. You have to do the proper color conversions, and there's a science behind that. getting it out onto for distribution, fine. You have an HDR reference system, reference monitor, fine. Everything looks great there, but most of your distribution is going to be to lower grade displays, and you have to do the proper color grade for those displays. You have to make sure you can do color grade for SDR, for example, and then you have to look at the new HDR technologies that will allow you to do a more selective or interpolating color grade for intermediate devices, but that's something that you need to do.
And let's be clear about this. We're not talking about, oh, it might look a fraction not quite right. If you start clipping as you're going out of an HDR color space into a more standard one, you're going to get really very, very wrong looking imagery. It's not like it's a very, very subtle thing you can't really tell. This is something that anyone would see.
Yes, and I can illustrate that and show that, yes, you get very bad clipping, but no one in the right sense would do it that way.
Sure.
I mean, there'll be some, hopefully, some sense for quality, and they will have to figure out how to do color grading for that. So I expect the color grading to be there to solve the problem.
But it is important to get it right.
It's a second step.
Yeah.
It means you have to do second step. I mean, first you got your HDR content, looks great, fantastic on your HDR display, but you have to do a second pass to reproduce those colors acceptably on an SDR device. You cannot do it automatically. You can get help with automation so that you can get it into the range, but it doesn't preserve the creative intent. As an example, being shadow details versus highlight details, where is the story? Where is the hero in your image? That's the sort of for the colorist today to make the decision of which part of the image to preserve the most going to SDR.
Yeah, so let's work through that for a second. When I've got my imagery in an HDR space, the sort of nature of the way it's defined is with much higher nits at the high end. It really holds like pings and details and stuff. But as I think you said, this sort of rocks the boat a bit when I might be used to doing certain tricks in gamma to maybe get contrast. And it's just not going to work. Can you just highlight that for me?
So you think about if I'm doing classic SDR grading systems.
And I start using like a gamma to get my contrast.
Yeah. That's great if you're doing it for the midtones. You do from black to diffuse white and you apply a gamma function. It will change your midtones appropriately, you get the right contrast, and your blacks and diffuse whites stay the same. Well, if you did that in an HDR environment, you darken your midtones, you get more contrast in your midtones, you darken the midtones. Well, your other end of the dynamic range will swing and you get something that's much brighter. And I think I did some math about that and say, let's say you darken your midtones by a couple of percent, say 5%, 10%. Your super brights might swing by a factor of 4. This is going to be impacting the creative result. You don't want to do that. You want to have something nicer, some nicer tools. And right now we don't have those tools. The SDR tools were nice, easy to use. We don't have the same toolkit yet for HDR that is as easy to use and gets as predictable results as we did for SDR. We're waiting for those to figure out what to do with those.
So one of the notions that you've touched on there is the idea that I'm going to have to grade something for an HDR and separately grade it for SD. And by SD we mean HD, SD in the old sort of dynamic range sense. But there is a concept that I could do this process with metadata such that the metadata actually gets encoded along, and we now suddenly have some key, effectively, some metadata key that unlocks what's going on later in the pipe. Can you explain that concept?
Yeah, so imagine you have an HDR master. You may or may not have an SDR master, but you have SDR grading information. But let's take the case we have an SDR master. You can compare the HDR master and the SDR master. You can derive the grading information between those two on a clip level, because all the clips are probably graded differently. On a clip level, extract the grading information and put that as metadata with your HDR master. Now, as you carry that around, you will carry that metadata on a frame level. As you carry that around, you can still edit your HDR master. Not color grade it now, but you can edit it, take out scenes, add scenes. Well, you have to have color banding for adding scenes. But when you now say, I'm now going to distribute this send it to the plant, distribute it to the SDR, you can then at that point apply the metadata. Or if your TV set is intelligent, has the capability, you can send the HDR master with the metadata to the TV, and it will adjust the image for the dynamic range of your TV set. So let's say your mastering display might have extreme high dynamic range. Your mastering display might support like 4,000 nits. Today, that is available as mastering displays, but not on the consumer side. Maybe you can get 1,000 nits, 1,500 nits on the consumer side.
Which is still a lot more than I'm getting off my SDH.
Yeah, sure. But you don't want to have that 4,000 nit signal being clipped or scaled down. You want to have a soft, nice roll-off. The metadata tells you what kind of roll-off you should do. And it tells you, do you preserve, where did you put the midtones, the diffuse whites, where do you want to move them to when you go to a lower dynamic range display? Now, for 1,500, it's not that big a deal, but if you go into from 4,000 to 100 nits, one example being in HDR, you can happily put your diffuse white at 200 nits, 300 nits, 400 nits. It still has a lot of headroom, and you can utilize that. The snowy scene can be bright, and the dungeon scene is really dark. And with an HDR display, you still see all the details. Now you're going to move that into an SDR environment. You have to fit everything to a much more narrow range, that the diffuse white has to be below 100 nits, so you have to move those bright scenes down. And the dark scenes, well, if you didn't do anything, you would not see any detail at all on the SDR display. You have to brighten them up to sort of bring them into the SDR range. This wasn't an issue before you had HDR. In SDR, you would have fixed that already in the camera, because there was no other way to hold it, to hold the detail. There was no other way. But now you're suddenly moving this responsibility from the camera operator to the colorist. And the colorist now have to make the judgment call. What do I do to make it look on my SDR display? Yes, we can have automated aids, tools that can analyze the footage and say, yeah, okay, this scene can be done this way. Here's a rough cut. This is like the base grade you get, and now you have to go and still do some trim pass.
Yeah, I mean, you made that point pretty solidly, that this isn't going to be some magic button that everything gets solved. It really is likely to keep
maybe
people...
sometime in the future we have real artificial intelligence that can track the story and say, oh, the monster is now in the shadows. That bright thing over there is not a monster. It's a dark thing over there that's the monster. And by the way, it's that orange ball over there that is the hero, not that other orange ball that is not so quite bright. And having the artificial intelligence, maybe we have to read the story, I don't know, figure it out.
Okay, but until we get Hal from 2001 to be a colorist, there is actually a very real job here for a human being.
Absolutely. Colorists might have to double the amount, not quite double the amount, but significant more work than just doing an SDR production.
Okay, so we've been talking about this high dynamic range and the fact that in the coloring and in the output and stuff, there's a lot of things going on. But is somebody who's watching this, is this going to be, oh my God, this is in addition to everything that's going on in the world with Asus? How does Asus overlay on top of what we're talking about?
So Asus is a slightly different way. You can think of it as a slightly different way of doing HDR. It's a unified working space, the Asus space, and it's one step removed. The HDR spaces are what we call display referred, which means the HDR content is fitted to a display. However it looks on the display, that's the right way of representing HDR contents. The Asus is more what we call scene referred, linear light. It's suitable for visual effects because it's linear light. But the way we go from Asus to the display, we go through several transforms. Those transforms will impose, for example, the reference rendering transform imposes a film look, or sort of high dynamic range film look, and then there are other transforms that will fit it to the chosen output device. And those transforms both render the dynamic range, but also sort of impose a look suitable for that type of device. So in a way, you're doing a little bit of indirect operation, like your steering wheel is not quite connected to the front of the car, so you have a little bit of lag there, and you have to get used to it. It's a different way of working. I think people can get used to it, but it's definitely a different way of working. And the goal, though, is that now you have more of a device independence. your Asus master is not bound to any of the output devices. It's not bound to any of the output systems. You have high dynamic range already in the Asus side, and fine, you can, when you go to your HDR TV, you actually might go down in dynamic range compared to Asus. But you have all the contents in Asus, and that's sort of the benefit of this.
So in the near term, what I'm hearing is that it's likely that Asus and high dynamic range workflow are going to coexist, and in fact, one feeds the other, even though, of course, as you pointed out, one tends to be, effectively projector orientated, one tends to be camera orientated, one tends to be scene deferred, one is output deferred.
Yep. And actually, what I would think would be interesting to see if we can use the HDR workflow as a way to edit Asus. Okay. This is not exactly the Asus model, but the HDR workflow is direct. I see on the display directly what I'm doing in my color space. If I move a slider to the edge, it moves the color to the edge of the display. If I do that same thing in Asus, that's not having quite the same relationship, but I can convert back and forth. So if maybe it's an interesting thing to be editing my Asus content in HDR space and then convert it back to Asus, as long as I can do it losslessly, which is the challenge that we have.
Yeah, I mean, you should have theoretically enough bits and enough floating point space to be able to do things effectively lossless.
Yes, effectively lossless. But that's sort of we have to see. That also then depends on the coding space. I have to have enough bits in the HDR space, and it's not clear from an editing perspective if I should edit it, for example, in the ST2084 PQ space, which is really fitted for the display, or if I should edit it sort of in a floating point space or some other space that might have more bit depth than an encoding that's suitable for a display. Because if I am using a space encode, if I'm using something suitable for this display, one example being if I want to lift everything by a stop, might bring out banding in the shadow details that I would not see with a more detailed encoding. So that's one reason to use more bits in the working space.
We kind of clarified what's going on there with Asus and high dynamic range, but people have heard, say, Dolby Vision. Where does that fit into this equation?
So Dolby Vision is one system for doing the automatic or semi-automatic conversion from HDR to SDR. It allows you to capture metadata. It does some steps automatically, and you can, as a colorist, you can modify parameters. There's a dozen parameters to set to get a nicer look on an SDR display. You're in control as a colorist. The metadata is embedded with the HDR master, and when sent to an HDR Dolby Vision compatible device, that device will process that metadata and reproduce the result that you had on your SDR display.
Right, so in that workflow, I could have a Dolby Vision decoding device thing in terms of at a hub, or it could literally be built into the actual monitor I'm looking at.
Yes, I think we're going to see some Dolby Vision displays coming out this year that contains it in the display, but it's just as equally well possible, as you say, to have it in the plant, to do the conversion in the plant. And actually, for many cases, I think there will be conversion in the plant.
Yeah, I imagine that you might have a Dolby monitor in the facility so you can see what's going on, because there's no reason that it couldn't choose what's on that display, because it knows, and then of course pass it down the line knowing that you've got something that's secure for a hub type distribution.
Right, yes, that's correct.
So we obviously, from my point of view, we look at After Effects, but there's also Premiere, Photoshop, of course, a whole lot of things. So what's Adobe's point of view in terms of this color science, HDR stuff? Where is you sort of sit as a company?
The ultra high def HDR is important stuff on our roadmap, but there are more things going on with the standards are not done yet. I'm heavily involved in doing the standards development through SMPTE. There are other standards organizations as well. There is no HDR standard today, so anything we would do today would unfortunately be a temporary solution. We don't know if HDR standards will, for example, be including HD TV resolution, if it will be based on 1920 by 1080, or if it would require a higher resolution, or if it would require a bigger color space. Those things are still not resolved. Most likely it would be including higher frame rate, because of high dynamic range, you're likely to see more artifacts if you don't up the frame rate. But the other parameters are still unknown. And I'm working on part of those standards through SMPTE, like the dynamic metadata, but the actual frame rate, resolution combinations, I think that's coming out of ITU rather than out of SMPTE, and I'm not engaged in that.
As Adobe users, I guess we're very reassured that Adobe has a seat at the table and that you guys are actually helping to formulate some of these discussions, because it's terribly important, of course, that we reach some consensus. And thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Well, we really want to thank Adobe. Adobe, as you know, doesn't have a full Asus implementation, as I sort of touched on there, but I'm really reassured that they're so open to talk about these things. My hope is that they will have a full Asus implementation, or certainly an Asus CG implementation sometime soon, but it's great to see them embracing these things. They're being really open and honest and working with companies like us to try and get the message out to you. I'm going to say, if you've got any questions, ask me in the forums. I hope I'll be able to answer them. It is obviously a fairly complicated area, but we've done a lot on colour science here at FXPHD, and I think it's one of the real benefits of background fundamentals, that we can give you this kind of underlying understanding, so that when a client walks in to talk to you about this stuff, you have a good handle upon how to approach it and what the actual issues are. Until next time, I'm Mike Seymour. See you.